Good afternoon. Welcome here, and I welcome all of you. And we'll get us for the signing, and it will be posted. The technical issues for the meeting ends. 2021 news, and I'm grateful to we're engaged educators and care vaccine distribution. A significant update in that regard that we have posted. I view a very, and I'm with a real goal of
welcoming every year, but we've got a long listing for early education around sharing EC licensed or exemples, as you know, through those programs and how to improve community to this effective partnerships between SCREX and community-based programs to support young families during and after the pandemic. They'll all be materials that are discussed during this 10 months into their own expansion of these best briefly on the issue of COVID test strategy, whereby groups of students, then the entire group structure of early education, including things like the small size of many programs and classrooms, the variation in develop and implement a pilot for early education and care, or do a more formal announcement shortly. And if the data from the pilot, ideal, obviously, if the
Thank you, Secretary.
There. For 1 second, and I
Good afternoon and welcome again. This is our second attempt this afternoon at a public meeting, first meeting of the new year for the Massachusetts Board of Early Education and Care. Thanks to those of you who are joining us from your communities. We are thrilled to regroup and launch the new calendar year. Tumultuous as it has been in the surround and the sort of formidable challenges ahead, the work has continued, and I'm grateful to the commissioner and her team for their ongoing and sustained tremendous efforts, as well as those of the field as we continue to work through the very significant public health crisis. We have an agenda today that is certainly forward-looking. I will start by just suggesting, for the board and those of you in the field, we had initially planned a vote on this, on the parent fee strategy. We have since had some very nice design thinking and modeling by the commissioner and her team, and the folks, our external partners in this work, have really arrived at what I think of as a really nice, elegant, kind of easy to explain and implement strategy. So we'll hear about that. We will not vote then until February, just to give us some time to think about it. We'll largely organize around what will be the culminating item, the budget update, both a spending update, but also and especially our priorities for FY22. The systems level conversation in many ways will tee up aspects of that final item. Thanks to those of you for public comment. Certainly going to turn it over in just a moment to the secretary on the very important and pressing issue of testing for early education and care providers. On our side, on the board side, I just want to underscore that in the coming weeks, we will have a very robust update on thinking through the vaccine rollout for early education and care providers. Thank you to colleagues Nikki DeLuise-Riaga and Allison Schoenwald for their partnership as we think about ensuring that when phase 2 starts, early education and care providers have a clear path, both messaging and in practical terms, for how to take up the opportunity to be vaccinated if they wish. So I will now turn it to the secretary who will spend some time on testing and also on some work, some very important work on remote learning standards.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hello again, everybody. Happy New Year once again. For those of you who were on this call before or who were able to sort of listen through somehow magically through the streaming, I apologize if I'm going to repeat myself, but I have no choice. I'm going to repeat myself. And as the chair said, I do plan to offer just a couple of updates. One is related to the development and launch of a new initiative by EEC and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to share best practices, specifically with regard to remote learning programs, and then also to provide an update on the status of a COVID testing pilot. This was the former topic, the one about the best practices in remote learning, is incorporated into the first item on our agenda, and we can certainly circle back at that point. On the other hand, we may save a little time by my just giving you an update right now. So let me jump into that. As you know, there are many EEC licensed or exempt programs that have been offering care to school-age students during the school day. And through those programs, we have heard the need for additional clarity about how to structure a developmentally appropriate remote learning day for young elementary school students and how to improve the communication and collaboration with school districts. As a result, over the past month, my office has convened a working group from EEC and DESE to discuss the best ways to promote developmentally appropriate remote learning practices for students in pre-K through grade 3, and to promote effective partnerships between schools, parents, and remote learning providers. Specifically, the working group is putting together a 4-part webinar series with school districts and community partners that kicks off this Thursday. The topics that will be covered include, and I'll just sort of read directly what the titles are for each of the sessions: incorporating engaging instructional approaches that are responsive to developmental needs, building strong collaborations between public schools and community-based programs to support young students and their families, engaging students with disabilities and English learners, and culturally responsive approaches to engaging with families during and after the pandemic. Following the webinars, the agencies will post and share materials from the presenters and from the discussion that occurred live. These will, I should note, will be taped. So to the extent people can't make the live events themselves, they will be available online. And in addition to posting the materials from the sessions themselves, the agencies will be posting other tools and resources to help districts and partners translate the lessons learned over the past 10 months of work and remote learning into their own practice. At the same time, we are working on a targeted proposal for another round of grant funding to support the implementation and expansion of these best practices and partnerships. And there'll be more to announce on that front very soon. I also want to comment briefly on the issue of COVID testing. As you know, the governor announced last week a new testing initiative for K-12 schools based on a pooled testing strategy, whereby groups of students, perhaps whole classrooms and their teachers, would use nasal swabs that are analyzed as a group. If the group analysis is negative, then the entire group is presumed to be negative. If the group analysis is positive, then every individual would be tested using rapid point-of-care test kits. This program was designed for the specific context of K-12, but we believe that testing can be a valuable tool and is a valuable tool for helping early ed and childcare programs open and stay open too. Given the distinctive structure of early education, including such things as smaller class size, smaller sizes of programs and classes, the variation in daily attendance, the need for clinical certifications, among other things, the commissioner has been engaged in conversations with philanthropic partners to develop and implement a pilot for early education and care that meets the specific needs of family and center-based programs. The commissioner is reviewing the pilot with the command center, and we look forward to a more formal announcement very soon. If the data from the pilot is positive, which of course we hope it will be, we'll be in a position to roll it out on a statewide basis. So with that, Madam Chair, let me turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you. Questions or comments for the secretary on those two issues? Carolyn and then Joan, and feel free to use the raise your hand function too, so since I can't see everybody on one screen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So first, I just wanted to comment that I'm happy to hear that there's going to be more collaboration with DESE, with our childcare providers. I think we all know firsthand that the EEC field has been asked to take on more and more during this time of the pandemic, and asking them to also manage remote learning that is the responsibility of K-12 is definitely in need of additional support. So I'm glad to hear about that. I'd be interested in hearing about the grant funding. Is that going to be targeted for the EEC field, or is that something, I'm not sure where that's going to. And then with regard to the vaccine, I'm also happy to hear about that news that our field is going to be included in that. And certainly they've been asked to stay open the entire time and to take on additional responsibilities during this whole time. So I'm glad to hear about that equitable proposal as well. Thank you.
And just to, so just clarify that what I was talking about was testing as opposed to vaccines, but you're right. Both early ed and K-12 educators are incorporated into the phase 2 schedule for the distribution of the vaccine. In terms of the grant program, the principal beneficiaries will be the programs themselves. The issue is not the issue, but there'll need to be joint proposals coming from a school district and the local providers in order to ensure that there's real partnership and collaboration. And we're obviously, to the extent that districts may have resources, federal resources and otherwise, we're certainly hoping that they'll be able to provide some financial support if necessary as well.
Joan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, I'm very encouraged to hear about this collaboration emerging between EEC and DESE. That's really, really welcome news. I'm wondering if you can expand at all on what you shared relative to testing, not only what folks in the field might expect, but also how that's going to be supported. And also in terms of vaccines and phase 2, I think, as you know, there's a lot of concern within the field about equitable access, and anything that you can say at this relatively early stage about what people might expect, I think would be really helpful to hear.
Yeah, well, just in terms of the vaccine, I don't unfortunately have additional information to report. That's very much a discussion, an active discussion that's underway with the command center and public health officials as well as others to try to work through how the sequencing will work as we move from one phase to the next. As you know, even within our current phase, there are a number of issues around how to fully utilize the vaccine resources and assets that are available. So it's an ongoing conversation, and obviously as soon as we know anything, we'll be sharing it as with all of you and with the broader public as well. In terms of the testing, I don't want to overstate my knowledge of the pilot that's being developed. But the idea here is, I think, at a very high level, and Commissioner, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is to establish some regional testing sites that will prioritize early education providers and participants in order to give them really timely access to testing and results so that they can minimize the sort of interruptions and disruptions that have occurred as people are awaiting tests, are trying to schedule tests, are being forced to quarantine because they've been in close contact with someone who might be positive. So it's trying to really accelerate the access and the turnaround time on testing in order to make these sort of disruptions less frequent and shorter. And again, I think we're going to obviously monitor this closely as in terms of its pilot phase to see whether, from a practical point of view, from in terms of just the administration of it, as well as its impact on these variables I was just talking about, to see if we can take it to a statewide level.
Yeah, and I think, as the Secretary said, I think trying to solve that problem is exactly what the pilot's doing, and we can we have a few more operational details to figure out, but we'll be able to give more details soon.
Mary and then Joni.
Thank you. And I'll be really quick. I know we got a lot to get through. Mr. Secretary, thank you. And thanks to everyone, including you, all the hard work addressing some of the issues that have been raised, certainly by the field and others. I may have just misinterpreted your information with regard to the assistance with remote learning instruction. Can you just speak? It seemed to me, and again, I could be wrong, that it felt that the various seminars, et cetera, were geared primarily towards the provider community and the educator community versus parents. And I'm wondering if you could just speak for a second about where you see parents fitting in to learning how to really handle and work better with our youngest learners.
Well, I think that's right. The target audience is the providers, both in the districts and in the programs themselves. Part of the focus will be, though, how to interact effectively with parents and how to not just communicate with them, but involve them and support them in the work that they're doing with their own children when they're outside of the school or the program setting. But it's a good question. I think one of the things we need to, as we roll this out, we should certainly think about the potential for extending it to other audiences, either just by making it available or by, perhaps offering some additional sessions that are targeted or formatted, if you will, in a way that's more convenient and more relevant to other folks, parents in particular. I think it's a good point, and we ought to pay attention to it.
Certainly lots of that content could easily probably be redirected and or just brokered. Joni.
So thank you. I think I'll start with feeding off of Mary's comment and then work backwards. Obviously, I feel strongly that families should receive the information too. And I think we have several opportunities that exist in both departments to work with family engagement efforts. DESE is rolling out some family engagement grants right now. We obviously have the work that we've been doing in EEC. So I think there's certainly a place for it. I am very glad that the early childhood community, in terms of licensed providers, are being looked at for the vaccine. I'm disappointed that they're not being considered having the vaccine testing at the same time. I think that's really a disservice to many of our colleagues. The last thing I want to comment on is something that I often talk about, and am looking at this again as an opportunity to think about the role of EEC in collaboration with DESE. And this is obviously a conversation that we've had at the board level and on individual levels. Regarding the remote learning, I think that it's wonderful that the webinar series, and I'm already signed up, I'm there, will be done in collaboration. I think that's great. But we have opportunities with other initiatives such as QRIS, professional development, CFCE, and most importantly, our learning standards to really do some ongoing collaboration with DESE. And I'm glad that it's back on the table, starting with this remote learning. I know behind the scenes, there's lots of work going on in terms of collaboration. But as we think about our pre-K or even the birth through 3 continuum, I think that this is a fabulous opportunity to kickstart it again.
I agree. Thank you for saying that, Joni.
Thanks very much. Okay, let's hear from the commissioner, just in terms of some opening comments, and then we will launch into our work together today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair Lasso. I wanted to just highlight, as you know from the materials today, we have a packed agenda full of really robust and I think forward-looking items for discussion. But as we have seen some stabilization in the data, I just wanted to take this opportunity with you all to highlight a few data points just to let you know the updates. So we have had 80 additional programs open since our meeting in December, totaling about 6,800 programs as of January 11th. So just to give you an idea, obviously very much stabilizing in terms of who is open, but I wanted to be able to highlight that as we're looking at that. I also wanted to highlight something that is coming up, and I know many of you have had an opportunity to see some of this data more in depth, but wanted to link it to our work as we think ahead, that we were really excited to partner with the Massachusetts Business Roundtable, as you all know, and as well as the Housing and Economic Development secretariats to be able to publish the results of the November employer survey that we had referenced with you all. We will make sure that you all have the full slides and know that those have been started to present on by our colleagues at the Massachusetts Business Roundtable and the Emerging Business Coalition. But I wanted to highlight 2 data points as we're thinking about how we look ahead. We had over 400 employers across the Commonwealth respond, which is a pretty remarkable rate compared to some of what we've been seeing, and very thankful for the partnership across the state government to help really leverage this. I know that there is a ton of interest in getting a deeper understanding and conversation on it, but wanted to really remind that there were over 90% of the respondents really had expressed concerns about the childcare and remote schooling. And I think that the part that I think to continue to highlight, given the data that we've seen come out on the workforce, is that there are still that the majority of respondents, and I think increasingly so, we've been hearing this outcry, are really concerned about the negative effect on women and women in the workplace. And that really we see that what we've been hearing back, and as we've been presenting, that while people are feeling like they are taking, employers are taking as many proactive steps as they can on addressing these concerns around flexibility, that are feeling like some collective action would be helpful. And so looking eagerly to partner and think about how we can innovatively support them in trying to understand where EEC can be a partner in that innovation, that collective innovation. So we are looking to do that, and over the next months, we'll be going deeper and having deeper conversations and looking to partner with the business community that now that we have this data. So I wanted to highlight that, as it's not a huge part of the meeting, but is something very that will have increasingly momentum over the next couple months. I also just wanted to highlight that what we're talking about today really builds on the conversation, and so that we've been having, and that when we talk about the systems, it really does mean supporting educators and programs and children and families. And so excited to dig deeper into that too today. Aside from that, just looking, highlighting the next ones, but those were the key data points, and given our timing, I will close there and look forward to talking a little bit further as the meeting goes on.
Great. Thrilled to hear about that response rate and some really good state level and local data. Certainly lots about the national patterns, but really important to get those data to drive some of the local decision making here. So that's great. Thank you for the update. I can see how those data could be very helpful in some subsequent work of the agency and the board. If there aren't other questions or comments, feel free to use raise hand. I think we will launch in. Our routine business starts with the minutes from our December 8th, 2020 meeting, which was obviously also remote. I did not have any edits or issues. I don't know if others did. Feel free to jump in if you have corrections or edits. All right, I'll go ahead and make the motion that we approve the minutes from the December 8, 2020 Early Education and Care Board meeting. I have a second.
Second.
Thank you, Allison. All right, I'm going to do my roll call, but I'm going to use the screen. Mary Wallachie, all in favor of going ahead with
Yes.
approval? Mary, Eleonora.
Yes.
Sorry, Eleonora Villegas Reimers. Joan Wasser-Gish.
Yes.
Jim Pizer.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Joni Block.
Yes.
Allison Schoenwald.
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz de Lizarriaga.
Yes.
David Cruz.
Yes.
And I think that's everybody. Thank you. Let's now go ahead and move to our items for discussion and action. We'll start with the parent fees. And as I framed up, I'm very, feel very heartened by the change and the further work. Sometimes the iteration really does produce something that feels much superior. And I think in this case, it's sort of both, in my view, technically a very nice solution, and also one that lends itself to very clear administration and messaging. So I personally would say that this is the first solution that I have spent time with that feels like it hits upon each of those dimensions, which are really important in policymaking. So I'll turn it over to the commissioner.
Thank you so much. And just wanted to acknowledge, that on the posted agenda, the first agenda item being around the remote learning, and that was, the secretary did acknowledge that in his opening remarks and with conversation. So I'm happy to continue to take questions, but know that you all had a chance to ask some questions during that. So launching right into the parent fees, I'm going to give a little bit of background on how we got to this modification, and knowing that it does delay the vote and what that implication is, but let Jocelyn have a little deeper conversation around what the modification is itself, so we can have dialogue around that. So you have here the history, and as we were looking through the models that we presented to you last time, under some helpful suggestions and thought partnership, discovered in the data that there were some opportunities for us to think differently about looking at the historical, the trends and the process to get to where we were, that there might be a way that we could push the envelope on trying a little bit more innovation that would be more family friendly. So if we go to the next slide, as you know, reminding where we had been with our models, and really that where we ended up presenting last time around the two models that offer two different lenses, but the same construct around a fee starting and increasing over the course of a parent's income, ending at where our max federal obligation can be at 85% state median income. They all continued to hold that construct. And as we dug a little bit deeper into the conversation, continued to talk to all of you and got feedback. If you go to the next slide, we continued to ask questions and dig into the data, and found with that as we took into some of the considerations we were hearing back and were able to look into the data, that there was this modification that we were able to make and offer a fairly reasonably cost-effective, but substantially more parent-friendly to some of the specific parts of our caseload where we were seeing some of those cliff effects, where you do see that increases in salary are outweighed by increasing costs of a public benefit by increasing that, by an income raise. And so in that, we dug into this, and we're really excited to find this modification that would allow us to take what was some of the largest impact of that in, as you remember, stepping out of 100% federal poverty level into a parent fee created a disincentive to take that next dollar because you started getting charged a fee. And so ways that we might be able to help incentivize parents without penalizing them through their childcare costs in some way. Obviously, I will say, as Jocelyn digs into this is not something that another state is doing out there that we could copy and think about. And so we really are kind of moving the conversation forward in a way that we will be testing and driving towards that. The two things I want to highlight before I hand it over is what this conversation requires is not only a look at our revenue and making sure that we can afford it. And I think when you look at this, and we have the conversation later on around fluctuations in our caseload account that are slightly unpredictable given the K-12 landscape out there and the decision happening real time at the community level. But then also where we, so that is one thing, is really to look at that analysis and feel comfortable that we can make that decision. But I think the other question is really the time to build it out and do the communication, build out an online technology that would allow someone to engage with something that's not as cut and dry, but way more parent friendly, as well as the time to, so an online calculator, sorry, and building out the technology to restructure the way our technology calculates so that we have the time to do that well, test it, and make sure that we are rolling out effectively and with integrity. And so those are the things that are required as you listen to this, and I'll hand it over to Jocelyn to talk a little bit about what this is.
Great, thanks. You can go to the next slide. So the way we restructured, the basic structure of the parent fee chart that we had spoken with you about at the last meeting remains the same. The difference is in how we calculate what the base income is that we calculate the fees on. So if you remember, we had a chart that has multiple rows by family size. When you go above the poverty threshold, you start paying copays at 4% of your income, and that increases across the rows to 15.6%. In the original fee chart, that was calculated on a family's full income. So that initial fee was significant in comparison to no fee. What we've done is we've effectively discounted the income below the poverty threshold. So rather than calculating that 4% on the full income, it's the full income minus the income below the poverty threshold. So as an example, if you, as a single parent with one child, are earning $1,500 a month, and just for argument's sake, say the poverty threshold for that family size is $1,400 a month, once you move, your copay would be calculated on 4% of that $100 difference, rather than the full $1,500 of your income at that point in time. And that's true across the parent fee schedule. So this translates into fees that would then effectively, when calculated as a percentage of the total income, range from less than 1% of a family's income up to 12% of a family's total income. And we maintain the sibling discount rules that we currently have, where it's families would pay 50% for the second child and 25% of the fee by this calculation for each subsequent child. So we felt that this change really addressed the cost increases that parents were reporting experiencing when they began paying copays, and also increases affordability across the entire range of family size and income levels. You can go to the next slide. So you've seen some of these before. This just shows how this plays out for a single parent with one child. Again, as a reminder, the gray dot is the market rate for family childcare. The black dot is center-based market rate average. The blue lines are current fee structure. The dark brown line is the model that we showed in December, and you can see that jump when a family hits the copay threshold. And what we've done with the yellow line is we've eliminated that jump, and you can see that all fees are slightly lower across the distribution in this new model. And I'll just pause there for questions on the structure, if there are any.
Justin, can I just clarify, what's the, because here it looks different than it did on the Excel sheet. What is the high end where subsidies shut off? And I'm sorry if I should know this.
It's 85. So when a family hits 85% of the state median income, they're after that point, they are no longer eligible.
And that, and
sorry, I expanded this just so you could see the differences a little bit more clearly. So it's just not the same range.
Yeah.
And just to clarify, Nikki, that is the federal maximum that for childcare eligibility based on the federal regulations.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? If not, I'll move to the next slide. And this just shows the same graph, but in this case, it's a 3-person family, so it's a single parent with 2 children. So you can see there's a slight difference in the slope when you're paying a fee on 2 children. You can go to the next slide. So when you look at the distribution of the effects of this change in the simulation across the caseload, in this particular model, 99% of families would pay a fee that is lower or the same as their current fee. And as a reminder, we would never increase a family's fee until they hit their reauthorization period. But for families where fees are reduced, we would put that change in place right away. 98% of families would pay a fee that is 7% of all their total income or less. And I don't know if you remember, but in the last conversation, I highlighted that single parents with 2 children tended to end up with slightly higher fees as a percentage of income than other groups. In this case, 97% of this group would pay a fee that's less than 7% of their income. And the average copay would be 2.4% of income across all the fee-paying parents. The parent-free revenue is projected at $17.9 million in this particular model. Any questions on these results? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Let me just clarify that is 17.9 million projected based on pre-COVID caseload level. So two things that are very much fluctuating is the distribution of ages across our, that would drive some of these projections as we look towards FY22, is that the distribution of ages, obviously we pay a different copay amount for every, for the age, depending on the subsidy amount, regions, all of that, as well as the full day versus half day, so there's lots of factors that will impact that, but this is based on just an apples to apples comparison, the 72 to 17.9.
Right. Yeah. So even though the parent's copay remains the same across all types, siblings are slightly less, but the difference between the actual rate and the copay vary also. So there's a lot that moves around depending on the caseload.
Mary Wallachie. Oh, Joan, after that, Joan, sorry.
Just a quick question. What was the projected parent fee revenue before this change?
So our current revenue is 72 million.
You mean on the previous models, Mary, or do you mean?
Yeah, on the previous models.
The previous models, the Model 2 that we're comparing this to was around 34, 33, 34, again on previous caseload numbers.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You can, it's right around there, the exact, there's a point number, so you can look at that and I can get you that number.
Joan.
I have 2 questions. The first is, where do we get that 54 million? I know there's some provisions in the FY21. What does that look like going forward? And how can we keep an eye on our IE enrollment to make sure that we're able to maintain access even as we ensure enhanced affordability for families?
Yeah. I mean, thank you for those questions. And I do think that that leads into part of the answer is part of the dialogue we hope to have as we move into later agenda items too around the budget, because certainly, I think that EEC feels confident that given the fluctuations in caseload numbers and the projection that we will be back to some sort of normalcy where we're not every school age child needs a full day of care in our caseload, or, not so many, I won't say every, but so many full day children need a full day care in our caseload that the way we've been starting to look and answer that question, Joan, are twofold. Is one, to try to get numbers and project and see what they would be for next year, but also to start to look at the revenue trends so we'd be able to project the funding amount for decisions like this as we are committing to them. And so on that note, the $40 million that the legislature did dedicate specifically to the caseload, to the parent fee investment for this decision this year, we feel within that footprint, given the fluctuations in numbers and ages, that we would be able to absorb a fair amount of this change next year through that $40 million increase in a case, should that be sustained in our caseload account. And second, I think when you look at the way that we have been trying to look at our income eligible account, not so much as caseload numbers, which is hard to project, but more on the budget amounts, that we can see where there's room to make decisions like this without having to cut enrollment. And I think, again, in a system where we are 5 months into a new trend that there's nothing to compare to, we're doing our best to try to get some of those fluctuations so that we could feel confident by February that there was that the unintended consequences of a decision like this would be mitigated.
I had a second question. Thank you for that. I'm wondering if in the course of doing this research, there was opportunity to talk at all with families and to understand a little bit about that transition from being within the subsidized system to moving into the marketplace. Have we gleaned any information about families' experience making that leap?
Not through this process per se, but it certainly is something that we talked about through the strategic planning process, as well as looking at a lot of the national research. I think that that is really difficult. That cliff effect of going from a subsidized to market rate is really difficult, particularly in a market like Massachusetts, where the supply, demand, and cost constructs are compounding the complications of being able to afford market rate. And so as we think about that, there's we know that that's difficult, and I think that we have gleaned some strategies that might be able to help, but would take a longer, thoughtful, reconfiguration of some of our systems to be able to address. So this, is certainly a first step to trying to do that.
If I can just quickly piggyback off of that, that's why I was interested to know a little bit more about the higher level. I thought that it was around 85% because of the Excel sheet that you sent us. And I was comparing that to the sort of MIT living wage information, which is what we oftentimes use to calculate sort of, what a family needs to actually, exist without any kind of subsidies. And so it matches up well. It's sort of in that $90,000 a year range. And so we're looking at families that are much more able to afford something like this than, if they were on the lower end of the spectrum and expected to, bear the costs all themselves. So I personally, as somebody who, works with families that are low income on a daily basis, I'm very, very excited about this proposal. I think it's very progressive. I think that it's very good for families, and especially for those families that are struggling the most to afford quality care for their children. And I thank EEC for coming up with it. I think it's really exciting. I don't know of anywhere else that is doing something like this. And I think it's very exciting. So thank you.
So good to hear from you on that, Nikki, given your daily work, and also really nice to have the triangulation with the MIT living wage assessment. So thank you. That's great. And again, kudos to the team, Jocelyn, Sam, and others for sure. What else? Anything else we want to talk about on this item?
Can we just go to the one
I think
last
there's
slide?
one more slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just go to one last slide on some of the time frame. And we just wanted to make sure you're clear. So this is the proposal. We have provided the Excel sheet and all of the materials. Obviously happy to answer any questions you all have over the course of the month. But the intention would be to vote in February on the new parent fee chart. The way the budget was finalized is that we would hold public hearings. We're looking to do so on our subsidy regulations overall, so we can more appropriately incorporate parent fee structures and guardrails into our subsidy regulations. And we'll be looking to do that within 6 months of the vote on the new parent fee chart as allowed by the budget. And then I did highlight that the two investments we would need to make by the time we actually rolled out in order to be able to implement this and make it operational without making it confusing, which is both making sure our technology catches up with this, as well as having an online calculator that would help ensure that people have an easy way to calculate, because the paper chart won't be as easy when you have various gradations happening across the income thresholds. There are a couple other states that do have an online parent fee chart calculator, so we have some structures to go from there. Jocelyn, anything to add on that part?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, any other questions?
Sam, can I just ask a question? Do we anticipate that the technology will be available, the internal technology will be available?
Yes. Yeah, we have done some initial analysis in order to commit to be able to really feel like we could confidently get this out within the 6 months and be able to roll it out by the new fiscal year, and feel that the internal technology development is minor enough. We can certainly complete it within 6 months.
Good to hear. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great.
Excellent.
Well, there's certainly feels to me like we're in great shape. And of course, as you all know, there's time for further discussion, and we'll plan on a vote next month. So we're going to turn now to some system strategies. We're going to keep this item relatively brief so that we don't shortchange our final item. But I also think these tee up nicely some of our discussion around the budget FY22. So great.
Absolutely. I hope so. So as you know, as I mentioned, we have been really digging deep into each of the pillars and our strategies and the building blocks that we are engaging in throughout the organization to make sure that we are ready and able to fulfill the vision outlined in the strategic plan. Wanted to highlight and ground us. You have the appendix has far more details on these initiatives, but wanted to highlight, to Chair Lasso's point, a high level update on where these strategies and the specific initiatives are, so that we could get some grounding in what it actually is that we can expect for momentum for FY22 as we go into that conversation as well. So I will start with, despite the fact that it feels like we have been in pandemic mode for like almost all of my time here, we actually have been able to make some really substantive system investments and reconfigurations. And I just want to start here that this system strategy is 100% EEC looking at ourselves and orienting our work to the customers and the stakeholders and those folks that we're trying to make sure have the support they need to thrive in the field, which is all about the magnificent team that exists at EEC and their ability to really keep this work going, to do this self-reflection that is not only about looking at our own systems and protocols, but also our own behaviors and approaches, and how we, all of us, get in habits and routines that are worth reflecting on and understanding how we can revision. And I just want to give like a massive kudos to the EEC team, who has been sleeves rolled up in willing to engage in that in the middle of all the craziness and the pandemic. And so with that, some of the investments we've made to kind of build the roadmap around that are really looking at how we look at those infrastructure investments in EEC's frameworks that will help us be able to be the kind of efficient, effective support to the field that can grow and help them thrive. So looking at technology, our regulatory framework, and our staffing. So as you all remember, sort of at the last time we touched deeply on this, we spent time at the strategic plan talking about how we intended to launch into many of these things. We were wrapping up an internal business process redesign simultaneously to the strategic plan coming up that gave us an opportunity to look at our staffing and how we would configure ourselves towards achieving this plan. That work has continued, and we've not only been able to kind of come up with the more global, but now delve deeply into specific units to try to develop a protocol with the intention that over the course of time, we will have both one policy handbook, one set of unified regulations across all of our areas, one policy handbook that will help translate our internal and our external world, and then also protocols for each of our units that will help make sure that we know what each other is doing in a way that stakeholders not bouncing from unit to unit, but really understanding how this intersects. For example, background record check and credential or teacher qualification, those two things are intimately connected when you're talking about the same person needing to get into a role. And so how do we try to organize ourselves? So we've been doing that deeply with our protocols, unit by unit, as well as really thinking, which has led to this question of how and when will our technology be ready, as well as where and how do we need to reconfigure some of our legal framework so that we have those kind of tools that our teams need to be able to really actualize this. So moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight a few updates on these three areas. Again, you do have in the appendix a little bit more detail, and happy to delve into them, but knowing that these are really three critical infrastructures for us, and knowing that as we look at investment for FY22, in order to fully realize the regulatory review, we have to be able to reconfigure our technology and have the staffing available to implement with the support and intentionality that we envision. So we have been, as I said, we invested in a technology roadmap early that really did look at all of our technology, did an assessment of the state of affairs and the criticality. Luckily, unluckily, can't quite say which, the time frame of this happened just as we were kind of in COVID. And so not only did we have a team that was able to, we were launching this just as we were getting into the pandemic. And so not only was that able to actually get a sense of where our state of our technology was, but our technology roadmap actually looks at some prioritization for our technology based on the information we are seeing from the pandemic. So, whereas questions prior to COVID, we may have prioritized more on CCFA and thinking about our subsidies because of some of the rigidity in being able to transform the policies that the board was envisioning. Right now, given the licensing criticality and some of the barriers in our just regular licensing when you're trying to operate in COVID, more of our lead and licensing database has taken more of a precedent, and we've been looking at things like that. So just to know that that's part of what you see in there, but this has really been what we are doing. In addition, you have the staffing analysis out there and really being able to think through where and how we are making investments. We have been, as you all pointed out in the review, transitioning and working towards getting towards a leadership structure that will orient ourselves towards this new vision, really thinking about how our stakeholders need to engage with different functions EEC have and try to put those close together with routines to regularly come together and talk, but that takes capacity to be able to make sure that we are doing that. So strategically and thoughtfully and amidst so much change, I will tell you one of the most difficult things, unintended consequences of the pandemic, is onboarding staff is incredibly difficult when you don't run into colleagues in the water cooler in the bathroom to be able to follow up on a conversation. So trying to think about those structures is something that we've been really thoughtful for, and we've been intentionally building capacity that will help make sure that our staff, particularly as we think about working differently, has the support they need to be able to do so. And again, luckily, unluckily, in the pandemic, is that having these conversations amidst so much change around the definition of work, where you need to do work, what resources you need, and where you need to, what working on Zoom looks like, ways that we never thought we'd use technology before, certainly are offering new opportunities to look at staffing models and efficiencies along the way. But still needing that investment to really fully actualize, and as well being thoughtful about where we end up, and some of the conversations I've had with you, where we end up investing in a person that needs capacity around them to be successful, that we are thoughtful about how and where in the staging and sequencing, so we're not just setting people up for failure with jobs that are impossible as well. And finally, you guys saw the regulatory review in much more detail, or the initial engagement and ways that we will be structuring that in December around our engagement portal. So I won't spend too much time on that, but no, we are starting, we're drafting, we're conceptualizing, we're trying to reconfigure with some very specific strategies and feedback loops. And so you have the cadence of that, and where we intend to go out, some of the questions in the appendix, and that will launch at the end of the month. And we will start to get feedback on some of the initial thinking around separating by program type, for example, having an FCC specific set of licensing regulations, as well as the next steps on subsidy and all of that as it relates to some of the some of the action steps in February. So this is where we are on this, these three really critical components of being able to look at ourselves in order to achieve the vision for the Commonwealth. And so I will stop there. That is the brief overview I wanted to give before we get into some deeper conversations, but happy to answer questions, particularly if there's something of interest.
Great, thank you. I mean, certainly, lots of this is almost self-evident. It's also been discussed along the way in a number of different ways. And I think this is the moment to kind of continue both moving it forward, but also consolidating into a strategy that will really get to the operational vision for the agency.
And I think knowing that's such an important position on this. What we heard during the strategic planning is that having this wonderful vision is that there are gaps in people's experience with working with EEC to have trust that we could actually help them empowered to help us achieve that vision. And so being able to show substantive steps of where we are making difference, we are planning for the kind of difference we know that need to be made in these specific infrastructures, I think is also incredibly important to us, so that we have some of the credibility that there is the picture we want to paint for the future is viably operational, or has viable operations behind it, as we engage with the field.
No doubt. Questions, comments on this aspect? I think the key too is to understand it and to think about it. I think one evolution, at least in the time that I have enjoyed collaborating with folks at EEC, is to now understand it in quality terms, right? And not sort of technology per se, that in fact, the technology is just a vehicle to the quality improvement work. And I think that's a big piece of this too.
Yep, absolutely.
Great. Okay.
Excellent. So we'll continue to revisit some of this in February, just so you know, not so much on the systems part, but how some of the broader brush accountability across all of these, to be able to look at how do we want to be researching, understanding what's working, what's not, what research questions do we want to prioritize as we look to understand our innovations, but also the dashboards and ways that we want to hold ourselves accountable in the best possible light of that. If it's not working, let's try to redirect and do it better. And so that is certainly where the next level of systems, to be able to tie all of these 4 pillars of our strategic plan together around some public transparency about how we'll achieve that and how we'll know whether it is on track. Excellent. So moving on to our spending update. And so Sean is available, but I'm going to go a little bit of a different way if we've been looking at it. So I wanted to highlight some of this. So again, you have the charts and more of the detail in the appendix, but we've broken this conversation up into just 2 parts on this. We will start with the spending update and where our FY21 number is, and how a different way of looking at the caseload count, which is obviously the bulk of our spending in EEC, but also to then use that to have a little bit of conversation on FY22 and knowing where we are in the budgets, the ever evolving budget cycle of the pandemic, knowing that as FY21 launch wrapped up over the holidays and into January at the state level, that we're pivoting to FY22 and making sure that that we're clear in articulating the board's priorities as we navigate that. So you have here our caseload numbers, and the key thing to look at, and as you all know, our data is only accurate when the final billing numbers come in, which programs do have a little bit of dates. You have up until November here. We felt that in November with actuals, we were at a point where we had enough stability and enough months to start looking at trends of spending and not just caseload numbers. So one of the hypotheses that we've been talking about, looking at the landscape in the field over the last few months and as the school year started, was where parent uptake would happen around full day and half day in our school age enrollment. And so while we were seeing our numbers go down, we were also seeing the percentage of children and the number of children who in school age not necessarily dipping at the same level as our preschool and infant and toddlers. And in that, really understanding that that was going to be costly, even though we weren't really sure how to project some of that funding, given the uncertainty of where districts and where families would be by March, for example. And so as we've started doing this and understanding that historically the way that EEC has projected caseload numbers was looking at caseload spending was looking at our caseload and being able to make some assumptions about how that would play out over the course of the year. One of the difficulties we have now is trying to test any assumption that you can make about what will happen tomorrow, let alone next week. And so really wanting to understand how we could, particularly when the budget wrapped up and we had numbers around where the legislature and the governor had authorized our final spending levels, being able to make sure we were looking at the expenditures in a way that would allow us to maximize any flexibility we could find in not only trying to chase after the children, because we know that that's important and access and subsidies is important for family access, but also to make sure that we were stabilizing the programs that are that money accounted for and that our families would depend on, whether they needed it now or whether they needed it next summer, knowing that there was going to be a need. So wanted to highlight this is the lens you had been getting. But we wanted to go again, about 50% of our school age caseload is school age. And so we've seen that uptick even higher, both because of the decreased enrollment and because we are seeing school age children enroll. And so when we go to the next, if we go to the next slide, the ways that we started to look at this, and again, you have the numbers in the appendix, but wanted to just highlight for conversation here and in a way to try to highlight what those numbers, we thought the takeaways from those charts was really understanding how our spending trends were looking and how we could apply that to not only focusing on trying to make projections and budget estimates as we look forward, but also understanding and where we could find the flexibility and do things like invest in things that programs need operationally, like PPE, for example, even if we were not able to fund it through the per child mechanism that there's so much rigidity around from the federal level. And so here's the three main takeaways we wanted to highlight here is one that given that our school age, we looked at two data points I wanted to dig into. One is we looked at our school age enrollment and that what we see is that even though our enrollment is going down, when we look at the daily rate paid for school age enrollment, it's going up, meaning we're paying more children in full day over time, looking at September through November and looking at when as school age started. So when school age started in full day. And so when we look at that, I mean, it is hard to project out, knowing that school districts like Worcester are actively making decisions about the rest of the school year now, and that is a huge footprint for our caseload account. But knowing that is showing that it is very looking at our caseload numbers as a projection of spending will be inaccurate because we're seeing the spending already not trend to what our caseload would have traditionally. So that's the first thing, and that is specifically in we see that if you look in the appendix that specifically for our income eligible account. So you see that this is really that even though for those families that are opting into childcare, the income eligible, not the entitlement, but the eligibility, that account, although numbers in that account specifically, if you look at our numbers, are going down, that account, the expenses are actually going up over time. And so we're seeing that dramatically out in that specific line when you look at the numbers. The other thing, so obviously looking at month over month spending is difficult because there's a difference in the number of days per month that can be billed, right? Just because there are different numbers of days in every month. And so we look for key data points that we can compare month over month here. And hence why in the last one, we really looked at that average daily rate so that we could look at something that was comparable. And what the finance team were able to look at here is the decline in the daily spending rate. So what we have been looking at on a monthly basis is every month our overall footprint, if you look at the previous slide, is going down. We spent less in August than we did in July. We spent less in September than we did in August overall. But what we've seen is that rate over the last few months has slowed dramatically down to we're almost stagnant in our spending. So even though we continue to lose children, we're not continuing to spend less every month. And so we expect and we anticipate that by the time we get to December, given the influx in children, in full day children, that we will see that spend, the decline in spend either stabilize or even we'll see our spend go up and we'll be spending more as opposed to less month over month in terms of that daily spend rate. So again, I know this is nuanced and I know that this is a new way of looking things, so happy to answer questions, but given the uncertainty in the caseload numbers and the traditional way we've been looking at it, we started to try to translate that to dollars and looking for expenditure trends that would help us make more educated decisions on things like parent fees, which won't necessarily be able to calculate a number of children for next year, but certainly you all need to to have an understanding of how we're spending to be able to commit to a policy decision like that will have multi-year implications. The third thing that I would just like to state is at the bottom of this slide, and then we can open it up for questions, is that as you all know, we have worked to make our policies as family friendly as possible and make sure that we weren't preventing people from enrolling given the situation that families are in right now and the vulnerability of families. We have continued to try to look at we mentioned, I think in December, that the vouchers versus the contracts and where the under enrollment was, and looking at our contracts and across the board, we were able to open up the flex capacity, the cap on the flex capacity that they have. It had been pretty low, but given where we were seeing people needing, infant toddlers aren't showing up and school age kids are, we wanted to allow them the flexibility to move across contracts. And so we'll see what that happens. We just were able to do that this month, and we're watching it closely and having a system and are putting a system in place where we can get mid-month estimates so that we're not waiting and doing it in arrears, and we know that we'll be able to track that. But that is kind of our last ditch attempt to try to give programs as much flexibility to serve whatever families are in their community without any barriers. But that aside from that, we're really looking at spending. So any questions on that?
Jump in or raise hand, Carolyn.
Thank you, Sam. I guess so EEC costs are going up because there's more school age children in its programs?
In full day. Mm-hmm. So normally we would pay before and after school, but now we're paying the time that they're in school attendance. Wouldn't traditionally be in school attendance as well.
So have there been any discussions with DESE about their respective school district covering those costs?
I will kick that one over to the secretary. I think this has been more of our focus specifically on that.
Yeah, we certainly encourage this kind of collaboration and partnership, including resource sharing between districts and programs, but DESE does not have control over those dollars. They're all local dollars that the local communities have to make decisions about. So there's only so much that DESE can do.
Isn't there a lot of money coming in though for K-12 through COVID relief? And wouldn't this be an aspect of what's needed to occur because of the lack of in-person?
It absolutely could, but it flows directly to the districts. And the state can't put any restrictions on it.
Oh, it doesn't go through the state?
It flows through the state. The state actually, so quote unquote cuts the checks, but the rules under it are determined by formula. And again, the federal statute is pretty clear that while there are certain specific things that the funds can be used for, it's really up to the local education agencies or the school districts to determine how those funds are going to be used.
So is the commissioner initiating those conversations? I'm just looking at the equity piece, right? I mean, if EEC is doing the job of local school districts and they're getting relief funding, shouldn't they be sharing that funding with the party that's actually bearing the burden?
I don't disagree with you.
Okay.
I also think in practical terms, I also agree with you, Carolyn, and in some ways, since we're now out of the crisis, which is that operations had to pivot and everyone had all hands on deck moment, I think the one thing I have been thinking a lot about, and certainly we had just a very initial brief conversation about this earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, but I do think we've got to look now ahead to the next academic year, to a summer that needs a lot of hands on deck for learning loss and young children, and especially an academic year. I think this is probably unsustainable for EEC and not advised in many ways, right? There's a lot of work to do with the regular portfolio. So I do think we're right to start thinking about this looking ahead for sure. If not, if not the look back, then let's look ahead. Joan.
I'm just pointing out the reality too of that.
No, I hear you.
If there's financial consequences, then that's going to motivate the school districts to have that better collaboration and even incentives to, take back on more of the work that, belongs with them to begin with, but has been provided, through EEC. And it doesn't make much sense to me that there's no reckoning of that resources. So
I think that's right. It sort of conjures up like no good deed goes unpunished, shall we say. Joan.
I really appreciate Carolyn's comment. And Noni, I wanted to build on two dimensions on what you talked about in terms of really using this information to look ahead. I think while there's so much that we can't anticipate and there are so many unknowns, I think we can begin to sketch out some of the context that we can anticipate, right? We know that more and more general members of the public are going to be getting vaccinated. We know that employers are expressing concern about the availability and affordability of childcare for parent employees. We know that we're going to have ongoing increased costs associated with delivering high quality early education and care and after school. We know that demand is going to increase as people are called back to workplaces or as parents max out and kids need, constructive places to go and socialize and learn and get out of the house. And so, I think that there are a lot of trends that we can begin to foresee. And I just sort of want to pick up on a couple of things that you started talking about. I think we absolutely want to think about, what does summer look like? We have thousands, tens of thousands of kids who have been home. What does that mean for kids who are, under 5? What does that mean for kids who didn't go to kindergarten this year? What does that mean for kids who, had really, frankly, diminished experiences at critical ages when they're learning to read? What does that mean for students with identified special learning needs or students who are learning English? I mean, there's a lot that we know we need to be thinking about, and we could be really proactive about thinking about some of these collaborations, with community partners, but also with DESE relative to the summer and relative to going into the fall of 2021. The second dimension is, I think this has really big implications for how we think about FY22. I know that, our budget memo that we're going to get to is really talking about sort of level funding and flexibility, and I appreciate the context in which that's happening. But I think we also need to be cognizant of what may reasonably be coming down the pike. And we have to begin to think about what that may mean in terms of a supplemental funding request. We know that we're going to have more kids coming into care, that kids themselves are not going to be vaccinated, even if family members are. And so we're going to have to continue to operate childcare settings in a manner that's similar to what's happening right now. What does that mean in terms of capacity? What does that mean in terms of staff? There's a lot of questions that are going to really be driven by the resources available in this system. And we looked at that gray dot on the parent fee chart, which is the market rate. For families that are trying to come into a system where cost of doing business is now more expensive, I think we also need to envision ways in which EEC can engage in public-private partnerships to make access to care more affordable in new and innovative ways. And that's going to take resources coming into EEC in order to do the job that's necessary for kids and families. So I think we need to be thinking proactively on a couple of different dimensions.
Yeah, I agree, and I'll turn it over to the commissioner, but to respond as well, and the secretary. I do think, it's an incredibly shifting landscape. And I think the conversation we're having today is a moment in time that responds to current conditions, that looks ahead in responsible ways. At the same time, I think you're right. There's some knowns and unknowns in terms of implementation coming. For example, if you look at the rates of kindergarten redshirting, it looks like there's going to be lots of unpredictable sort of cohorts and ages there. And we don't know what is coming at a federal level. Not that we simply want to rely upon that, but I do think that's another element of the shifting landscape. So I think there is a lot on the table. I think our job today is to respond to current conditions, currently look to the commissioner in terms of what's absolutely needed, while also looking at some of the strategic plan. I think the sort of funding at the level of units, if you will, and trying to push the infrastructure that's needed is critical. But there's just no question that there are a number of moving parts, and that there is every reason to believe that we may engage in more conversations about the budget and needs in the months to come. No question. Commissioner Secretary, you may also want to chime in.
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk. I think, Joan, one of the things we've been really trying with this data is to try to put us in the best position to be planful and thoughtful looking forward. So hopefully, I appreciate the fact that this will prompt a conversation slightly differently than maybe has been in previous budget iterations, given the fact that the data has changed so dramatically in real time. I think that the questions, I'll let the secretary talk a little bit around some of the school entry summer thinking at this point, since that I think is not something we've been able to get to in too much depth on our side, given all the moving parts. But I think that exactly as you were saying, one of the things in looking at the budget and the spending and understanding our FY21 spending as it relates to FY22 is also thinking through where do these investments from EEC side make the most sense. I mean, I think the board long acknowledged that per child investments were difficult prior to COVID, and now acknowledging that. So looking at our spending and ways and opportunities and thinking about how do we use that caseload account differently, given the different landscape to invest in that can be future looking and FY22 and beyond looking. And I think that one of the questions as we look at summer is really thinking about where and how we prioritize that funding, and where some of those conversations would be prioritized across departments or at the community level in a way that that it doesn't pull away from the stability from the childcare providers, because I think that's the fear also, is that we're seeing this tenuous nature of our field and trying to maximize our funding, and knowing that there's also so much more need out there, and making sure that we're participating and helping, but not doing it at the sacrifice of some of our really critical infrastructure we're trying to sustain. Whatever.
I'm not sure how much I can really add that's all that helpful. I mean, as everyone has already said, it's just really difficult to predict the future, on all kinds of different levels, but certainly around utilization of childcare in the midst of this unprecedented time and the sort of overall decline in enrollment we've seen over the last 10 months. And the legislature, in part sort of took that into account in the way they structured the FY21 budget to enable any excess funds at the end of the year in the caseload account to roll over into, I guess they call it a workforce and support reserve. And there's also obviously new federal money that's available. So we have some at the margin, certainly we have some additional capacity and flexibility that we may not have under normal circumstances. But in terms of the summer, I think that the point you make, Joan, is a really good one. That at a minimum, we need to make sure that we're providing a broader array of summer learning options, activity and learning options, I should probably say, for young people, really of all ages, much more so than we would in a normal year, because of the lost time that they experienced and because of the disruption that occurred during the past year. And And that is certainly, you know, that there's an onus on schools and school districts to be kind of extending their typical summer school offerings, but it also means, I think, taking advantage of some of the both programs and partnerships that have arisen over the course of the last year in our part of the world, in part because those are often programs that are offering summer options anyway, and in part because of the capacity they've developed over the course of the year to deliver not just sort of more, again, traditional summer activities, but also maybe some educational activities that they hadn't previously been part of their service offering. So I think we need to be looking more creatively and holistically about how to make summer a really much more productive experience for a lot more kids than has been the case in the past. And I think there's a way for us certainly to leverage some of that federal money that's going into local communities and school districts that we've already been talking about, in addition to some of the flexible dollars that are coming into state agencies.
Nani, can I ask a question?
Of course, please jump in. I'm
Thank you.
Oh,
I
and
was
then I've got Carolyn with her hand up.
okay. Caroline, do you want to go first?
Oh, you're good, Eleonora. Go ahead.
Okay. I was wondering if it would be possible to extend that group that you created between EEC and DESE for the thinking about the providers and the educators right now that you were talking about at the very beginning of the meeting, and to extend that work to focus exclusively on what will happen in the summer, and then explore all the options that can be done together, DESE and EEC, and think about not only in terms of programming, but also in terms of funding, so that we all begin to plan from the very beginning right now what will happen in the summer. Even if we don't know what's going to happen in the summer, we know that we need to do a lot of work to catch up on what hasn't been done during the year because of the pandemic. So is it possible already you have the structure? Can we continue that work to extend to the summer work that needs to be planned now?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We should definitely consider it. It may be a different group of people. It may not be the same people in the room, but that's fine. I think the conversation, we benefit from the conversation continuing. So I think it's a great idea. Thank you.
Carolyn.
Thank you, Lonnie. I just, I'm concerned about, or Noni, I should say, I'm concerned about the issue of the school age children with regard to sort of, you know, especially children with special needs and those with high needs, right? They've been without in-person services for a significant period of time that certainly impacts them for a lifetime, right? And sort of looking at, so who has been filling, who has been providing services to them? And certainly I see EEC as someone that has stepped into that role, but also how to address the issue of compensatory services. And this is more at the state level and through collaboration with the local education agencies, because we're seeing a lot of different children at this point because of that extended period of time that children have gone without, and sort of working together to make sure that that collaboration with people who do know those children and have been with them during this time is certainly information utilized in developing whatever compensatory services, you know, a district is going to provide to a child. So I just want to reiterate the need for that collaboration across agencies and, you know, at the local level. But I would also still want further discussion on the budget piece, and especially in terms of whether or not some of these services would qualify for reimbursement to EEC, even as compensatory services, in that they were provided by EEC in lieu of the local education agency. So I just think that's a conversation that should be continued, whether or not that's a possibility.
Secretary, did you want to respond at all, or just flagging?
I'll take that question back. I don't know how to answer it
Yeah.
directly myself, but it's a good question. I'm sure there are probably some challenges associated with that, but it's worth exploring.
Yeah, and I think again, there's the look back and there's the planning ahead. And I do think that in some ways, long 2021 just began. In other ways, the summer is around the corner. And I think it's true that by spring, there's gonna be a lot of parents looking for relief, for options, for more intervention and services, et cetera. So appreciate that coming up. Anyone else want to weigh in or ask questions at this point before the commissioner moves on to the specifics of the priorities and the memo itself?
So I can't raise my hand on the screen. It's not.
Oh, sorry, Joni, just jump in. Yeah, everybody can.
I got it. So I agree with what everybody has said and appreciate the challenges that we have. I do want to bring up that EEC does have a slice of a piece of community collaboration that we can build off of in terms of some of our councils and some even some regional pieces and local pieces in terms of transitioning opportunities for families, children, and educators. And through our CFCE and through some other collaborations, we have community councils. And right now, clearly, the public schools are dealing with let's get ready for kindergarten registration. Mm-hmm. And what is happening to our current pre-K kids, whether they're in a public school or a community-based program. And I think we are just ripe for discussion. And I think this is a time to really dig down quickly into this.
Yeah, great. Anybody else on, before we just revisit together as a group, the priorities and the memo?
I'm just wondering aloud, based on what Joni just shared, whether as we think ahead to the fall, if it's reasonable to anticipate that schools are going to continue to have somewhat limited access, whether it's by day or by total enrollment, I wonder if it's a chance to do better than we did this past fall in really focusing on intentional collaboration so that students who may not have access to a school building could potentially have access to a safe and supportive environment within a community-based OST or early education program. I know some communities were fairly successful at being very intentional about that, while others really sort of put families in a much more challenging position. If we're able to do some looking ahead with guidance from some of the health experts to understand what the likely scenario is, it may be a chance to do a little bit of a reset and to do better than we were able to do in the rush of 2020.
Yeah, and maybe that dovetails, and then I'll turn it over to the commissioner, dovetails with the suggestion, Eleonora's suggestion, and the secretary's affirmation that some kind of working group might take up some of this space sooner rather than later. Yeah. Great, Commissioner, turn it over back to you for a next, I think there's one more slide.
Yep. Yeah, so we, based on this conversation and not this specific conversation, obviously these materials are done before, but the conversation ongoing with the board and understanding where our budget projections could reliably be given the fluctuations over the fall, we did work to try to target two very concrete and specific recommendations based on the board feedback that would really be able to, with reliability and integrity, give us the flexibility to move towards the board's larger vision, but also really maintain and ensure that we are making a reasonable ask given the uncertainty of the revenue projections for the state overall, but that we would be able to maintain investments in our programs and our infrastructure and not have to cut back on that, cut back on our existing expenses. So I will highlight, you have all of the materials, so I won't read them, but highlight that there are two components of that building on the momentum of FY. I'll say the momentum of the strategic planning in FY20, I don't know what to call FY21 and how we are there, but the analysis we are here and looking forward to FY22 of where some of the most critical components of the budget might look like to be able to make sure that EEC is continuing on the pathway of building back the field stronger, better, and to Joan's point, with trying to position our programs to be as collaborative partners as possible as the uncertainty of the fall becomes, as planning around the uncertainty of fall comes underway. So looking at those two priorities, you start with looking at our caseload account. Again, really thinking as we discussed, so I won't belabor all of the details of it, but really making sure that despite those fluctuations in enrollment that we're seeing, that we are allowing for the investments to be made more creatively through some shifts in the caseload language that would allow us to be able to understand the implications and a transition to a more thoughtful, sustainable funding structure over time, but really not doing that at the jeopardy of any existing structures or systems. So again, right now we feel like the questions that the advocates in the field have been asking us around paying for enrollment differently, not paying on current enrollment numbers, but thinking about capacity and March enrollment and previous data points that we might be able to drive investments for our programs. The caseload account and the federal language is limited, and the caseload account mirrors that federal language. And so the idea being that if we were able to try to think about our state and federal funding with more flexibility, that we might be able to try to find some solutions that would both help mitigate the impact on parents as they're coming back into care and make sure that these programs are leveraging every dollar possible to make sure our programs are sustainable, knowing that families will need care in creative and new ways as they return to work and return to some semblance of normalcy, even if we have many unknowns about exactly what that will look like. The second thing that we wanted to talk about is continuing on the momentum for the staffing and infrastructure. As I said, looking at FY20, and you have the numbers in the appendix, so I won't read them, but looking at FY20, we were able to make many substantive investments in staffing at some really critical capacity areas that we had seen huge backlogs or turnover that had gone backfilled. And so really making sure that we had the ability to invest in there amidst a pandemic. So we have done many hires and have been able to continue on that march towards building that really critical capacity, but know that that was an investment in being able to sustain operations and really to be able to transform and take on the larger vision that and not then recreate the backlogs we were able to get through in many of which for the slowdown at COVID helped a little bit, that be able to invest in the right kind of capacity, as well as that technology, because quite frankly, a lot of our inefficiencies in staffing are workarounds to technology, things that don't work, as many of you probably know from your own worlds. And so trying to disentangle those so that our staff can be at their highest and best use, and not trying to navigate and be tech support, as well as make sure that that we have the technology built in a way that build those efficiencies for them and really leverage all the possibility. So we're doing really thoughtful, that's hence the protocols and the technology development and staging and sequencing that. And the investment here helps bring through the next phase of that in FY22 is what we're advocating for. With that, I will stop and open that up for conversation. Again, you have the memo and just the bullet points up here.
Great. Happy to take questions or comments. And I will say every now and again, I just think I can't believe the timing of that strategic plan process and the pandemic hitting. Did you know something that we didn't all know? Because it just couldn't have been tighter, right? And it
Same.
has just reaped so many benefits for the work and the decision making going forward. So just
I
mention.
remember someone, I will remember someone saying right before I took this job, I was talking to someone about kind of where something, and they said, and I said, I really think, some strategic planning, we'll look at that, and it's obviously we need to revamp it. And they said, well, don't let it take forever. And all I can think is, I'm really glad it didn't take forever, because if we were still in the middle of that when we went into close everything shutting down, it would have been really difficult to come to culmination. But it really has served as such a critical guidepost.
Yeah. Yep. If you had said January to June, we'd be sunk right now. Any comments or questions? I obviously have had a lot of conversation with the commissioner and the secretary around this. I have obviously lots of support for where this is headed. Mary Wallachie.
Sorry. This is total nitpicking, and I'm not looking at the memo right now because I'm just not cross screens. There's something about us saying in number 1, maintain child care programs. We're education and child care programs. And I think we need to say that as much as, and maybe it's in the memo, but we've worked very hard to make sure people recognize us as not just a child care agency, but an education entity. So I would just ask to double check when the memo goes out that we're making that clear.
That's great. Thanks for that. Thank you for that reminder. It does need fixing the bullet number 1 in the memo. Good catch, Mary. Thank you.
And I think I just want to make clear out loud, Mary, as we do that some of that in the field sometimes feels like we've missed after school and out of school programs in that. So I just want to articulate that and have you all either nod or disagree with me if you don't agree, that when we do say that, it is not to dismiss the out of school and after school program. It is intended to be inclusive of them. And so I want to make sure that that is part of when we talk about early education care, child care programs, that it is inclusive of the whole spectrum of what we support.
Yeah, I think as much as we have the opportunity to say out of school time care as well, I mean, without making this thing, 20 pages long, but I just think there's still the challenge of people really looking at us narrowly as childcare, and to the extent that we can use these opportunities as a reminder is really just the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
So can I second Mary's comment in terms of this? I thank you for bringing it up, because I know that it is, as you say, Sam, embedded in the term, but I think as often as we can be explicit, I think really benefits the field and really the mission of EEC as a whole. So thank you again for bringing that up, Mary.
We can have a longer conversation, but there's also a point at which some of we need to also be sure that we are honoring the work of childcare writ large, and that we're funding it as the public good. So I also, it's an interesting dilemma to some degree, but yes. Any other comments?
Mary, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, it's a challenging time overall, but at the same time, right now is really an opportunity to capitalize on the business focus of our role as a child care provider to allow their employees to work. So,
that's right.
It's all of the above, and every one of those things matters.
Right.
And we just need to seize the opportunities when we can.
It's a little hot button too, because of course, this notion that you could be in remote schooling and not need childcare, right, has surfaced these major issues for families and employers.
And one thing we are cautious on, just try to balance that, and agreed, this is incredibly tense. And I think that something the field nationally really grapples with as we talk about, a definition that is changing under our feet, is talking about the infrastructure versus the service being delivered. And really one of the things that is really critical here is that we do need to maintain the childcare infrastructure. The service being delivered there is, of course, care and education and much more robust. But if the program can't open, then it doesn't matter what we're delivering inside. And I think that's one of the tension that has helped me try to think about how are we talking about both and here and not either or. And I just, if it's helpful.
Yeah, that is really helpful.
Yeah.
Anything just to go back to the big picture, 2 priorities, organization of the memo, anything else?
I think these are good priorities. I think this is a good way to sort of move things forward in the near term. But I just keep coming back to an understanding that even with all of the things that we can't predict, we really can anticipate that the cost of doing business and the need to innovate with the folks with whom we partner and how we're supporting access to early education and care or childcare or after school programs, across the board is in the process of really shifting. And we have to be prepared to shift with it because the infrastructure is critical to the functioning of our economy and to the recovery and support of our kids in their learning and in their futures. And so, this is just a moment where we can't continue to do things without adequate resources. We really have got to be in a place to move the field forward. And so this feels like a good next step, but I think we're going to have to be forward looking about where we go from here.
Yeah, and I think the monthly spending update and our sort of ongoing conversation at the level of the budget and spending in these monthly meetings is definitely in that vein, and certainly part of my ongoing conversation with the commissioner. So I appreciate that framing. I mean, one question is whether the only thing I'm just thinking about in real time with this memo is whether there's just 1 or 2 sentences about some coordination with K-12 going forward as it relates to some of these capacity and spending issues that have been raised in various ways over the course of this meeting. That's the only thing I could think of in real time that may demand a sentence or 2. I don't know what others think, Commissioner or Secretary.
So I'll make an attempt. I think it may not have a direct impact on the EEC budget per se, but to note that we need to make every effort to leverage our resources across the sectors in order to maximize the impact on children and the value to families, something like that, which on one hand sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but that doesn't mean we always do it. So I think it's worth reiterating.
And sort of like maybe, and maybe it's even with a framing of that there is just more planning and intentionality around that in that space, given the issues. Yeah, I think that's right. We can add that sentence for sure. Anything else? Last comments or questions? I can say personally, I appreciate the clarity. I appreciate that it's concise and that it tells a story that is very steeped in the priorities and the work of the agency, that the budget is closely connected to your strategic work, Commissioner, as well.
Thank you.
And as the recipient of the memo, I am also grateful for the work that went into it and its clarity. So yes, thank you for that. And I will just, as a preview, I'll have to recuse myself from the vote. But nonetheless, I do appreciate the work that went into this.
The opposite of hard feelings for you to recuse yourself and us to submit it to you. Shall I go ahead and make the motion, these long motions, right, Carolyn? I move that the Board of Early Education and Care, in accordance with General Law, Chapter 15D, Section 4, hereby adopts the Department of Early Education and Care's proposed fiscal year 2022 budget priorities memo as its budget recommendation, which reflects the investment priorities for the fiscal year 2022 in line with the department's ongoing strategic planning process. The board further authorizes the commissioner to submit the board's final budget recommendations to the Secretary of Education. Can I have a second?
Second.
Second.
Thank you. All right, I'm just gonna go down my screen. Mary Wallachie,
Yes.
Eleonora Villegas-Reimers,
Yes.
Carolyn Kane,
Yes.
Joan Wasser-Gish,
Yes.
Joni Block.
Yes, and can I add something?
Sure.
I think if we put something in that talks about the system K through 12, we have to also say pre-K.
Great, let's do that.
Thank you.
Allison Schoenwald,
Yes.
David Cruz.
Yes.
Is that everybody? I think so. All right. So approved. We will make that slight addition and submit this to the secretary. And again, I want to underscore that I am deeply committed to the shifting landscape, to the ongoing conversations. I think it's also great to have this monthly standing item that's around spending and caseloads and the fiscal context. And we will, as we have, just as a board, continue to support the agency and respond and to be very responsive in real time as the landscape continues to unfold. In some ways, kind of, we're in this like month to month. We happen to meet monthly. I think also lots is happening month to month, and we'll just continue to keep in touch on things, and watch the federal landscape as well. Commissioner, any other
I
comments?
just want to make just two quick closing remarks just to highlight, I think, to you all, and I know some questions from the field to make sure you all have these answers. One, I referenced the PPE, and there will be more information coming out about how programs can access our backup PPE if they aren't able to find PPE and stay open. I know we have seen people have had gaps or delays, and we have built a system, and that will come out next week with the number to call. And so just wanted to make sure you all knew that we had been able to solidify that, and we'll be launching it soon. Secondly, wanted to just hit on the vaccination question, and that I know that the secretary referenced that the conversations have just started, and just to let you know that we have been involved, and there have been some quick very initial, I know things are moving very fast, but very initial conversations around where we can support the childcare field in operationally being able to access the vaccinations. And so I don't have any answers. I know the field is anxious, and we're getting emails, and many of you are all the time, about how and where, and just to say that the initial conversations have begun, and we will make sure to keep people updated, but the EEC will be thoughtful in making sure that it is accessible across the hours and times and workforce that we know well, and working closely with DPH to making sure that that's accessible in vaccinations. And very initial conversations, I still don't have answers for everyone who's going to email, but I promise you that I just wanted to let everyone know that that is underway.
Yeah, I also think it could be, it's very likely February agenda item.
Look at that. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for your flexibility. Thank you to our tech support for resolving the issue, and appreciate your commitment. I hope everybody stays well and healthy, and we look forward to seeing you again in a few short weeks. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Bye.